On August 21st, 1889, at 2 in the afternoon, Red Flint sat in 94 degrees of high plains heat, with wind out of the southwest tasting of alkali and old ash. The town looked like something thrown together between train whistles. False front storefronts, a church with peeling clapboard, 2 smithies, 3 saloons, and 1 water tower whose legs leaned like a drunk trying to stand straight. Cattle dust hung in the air so thick it dulled the brass buttons on men's vests. Flies settled in black commas along the hitch rails. Over by the auction yard, someone had nailed up a board that read, in chalk, "Condemned property. Bonnet Bell Saloon, as is." By 2:30, every man in town who had spare time and a mean opinion had gathered to watch the widow make a fool of herself. She arrived behind a gray mule with a swayback and patient eyes, driving a narrow freight wagon with 1 carpenter's chest strapped tight in rawhide and 1 trunk lashed behind it. The trunk held all she had left from her husband: 2 wool uniforms, a folded flag wrapped in oilcloth, and 6 weather-smudged notebooks full of his small, exact writing. The chest held things that still answered to her hand: auger bits, framing square, adze, brace, plane, 2 sets of chisels, and a leather roll of measuring lines she had waxed herself. Stephanie Tucker climbed down in plain black bombazine despite the heat, her sleeves buttoned at the wrist, her collar starched, her face sun-browned enough that grief sat on it like a hard polish instead of a softness. She did not look toward the crowd. She looked at the roof line of the Bonnet Bell first, following the sag in the ridge with her eye. Then she looked at the gutters. Gone. Then the foundation stones where spring runoff had cut channels beneath the rear wall. "Ma'am," the auction clerk said, trying not to smile, "you do understand there's no guarantee on the place." "I understand rot when I see it," Stephanie said. "Call the bids." They started low, $70, $80. Someone offered $90 just for sport and withdrew laughing when she raised to $95. At $112 cash, no one topped her. The clerk struck the gavel against a whiskey crate, and the men along the rail made a sound like a flock of crows finding grain. "Well," one of them called, "if the widow means to serve black crepe with every drink, we'll have to start carrying handkerchiefs." Another shouted, "She bought herself a ghost and a rat cellar." A third, "Don't worry, boys. She'll be remarried by snowfall and sell us back the nails." Stephanie took the deed with the same hand she used for a level and gave no one the gift of a flinch. She had not set out from Laramie with a dream of running a saloon. She had set out because staying put had become another kind of dying. Her husband, Elias Tucker, had spent 12 years in Army logistics before he took civilian contracts guiding mule trains and wagon strings across country most mapmakers guessed at. He was a man who could look at a cloud bank and tell you how many days of feed to keep dry. He taught Stephanie to tie barrels against roll, to count mouths before counting miles, to never believe in one source of water when 2 could be had by labor. On winter camps, he'd make her repeat inventories at lamplight: flour, salt pork, lamp oil, quinine, twine, axle grease, bandages, spare shoes, nails, lamp chimneys, cartridge caps. "Luck," he would say, tapping the ledger with his pencil, "is what men call planning they didn't witness." He died in March, not from bullet or blizzard, but from a chest fever that came on fast after a sleet crossing near Medicine Bow. By the time spring softened the roads, she had sold the contract mules, paid his debts, and discovered exactly how many men spoke kindly to a widow while looking over her shoulder for her assets. Borders matrons invited her to sew. A cousin wrote from St. Joseph that there was still time to start again respectably. One rancher's sister suggested she marry her brother, as if matrimony were a practical shelter one could duck under in hail. Instead, Stephanie spent evenings with Elias's notebooks open on her table, learning him again through his margins. He marked weather patterns, rail delays, rates of spoilage, and where men panicked first when things went wrong. In one book, copied from a frontier surgeon's notes, he had listed emergency water usage by the bucket, by family, by horse. In another, he had sketched a compact cellar plan from an Army storehouse at Fort Bridger. Cool zone, dry zone, medical shelf, rope hooks overhead, lime wash against mold. By June, she knew three things. She needed a town with rail access, enough business to survive winter, and enough ignorance of risk that a person with sense could build value by simply preparing. Red Flint fit all three. The first time she walked through the Bonnet Bell alone, the place smelled of sour beer, mouse nests, and wet wood that had never fully dried after some old flood. Daylight came in through two cracked front panes and striped the room across abandoned gaming tables. Behind the bar, mirror glass had silvered black at the edges, so a face in it looked already half in mourning. Someone had painted a woman in a feathered hat on one wall years before. Now the hat was smoke-streaked, and her smile was mostly gone. It was the cellar people talked about. Every town has one story it feeds itself when reason would be cheaper. In Red Flint, the Bonnet Bell cellar had turned 3 businesses in 7 years. First owner drowned in debt. Second took sick and coughed himself into the grave. Third sold bad rye, got run out, and was found frozen 2 counties over. By the time Stephanie took the key, the tale had grown teeth. No liquor kept down there came up fit to drink. Barrels split. Pumps failed. Men who slept below woke with blood in their mouths and left by morning. She carried a lantern down anyway, slow on the stairs to test each tread. The floor was tamped earth with old plank islands gone soft at the edges. West wall damp. North corner crusted white from mineral seep. The vent shaft had collapsed halfway, trapping stale air. She crouched, pressed 2 fingers to the wall, rubbed grit between thumb and forefinger, smelled iron and rot. Cursed, she said aloud to the dark, or neglected. She spent her first 6 days not opening for business but measuring. She marked room lengths in chalk on scrap pine. Bar room 28 feet by 32. Back room 12 by 14. Cellar near 19 by 24, with 6 feet 6 inches of headroom under the joists. She climbed to the roof at dawn and set yarn strips on nails to map wind direction across the block. She counted how long rainwater took to run from the rear slope and where it pooled in the alley. She checked the town well line and found pressure weak by late afternoon, strongest before sunrise. She noted everything in a notebook of her own, neat and hard-edged like Eli's, except for one line she underlined twice. If this place fails, let it fail for weather or fire, not because I refuse to see. The inciting trouble came in the second week, arriving all at once the way frontier trouble often did. On September the 3rd, the rail agent tacked a notice beside the depot door. Supply cars delayed indefinitely. Washouts west of Cheyenne. Flour and nails first, then lamp oil, then medicine. Everything now dependent on whatever sat in town already, or what freight teams could drag in over bad roads. By noon, the sky had gone white-hot and strange. Lightning forked dry into the hills north of town without rain behind it. 3 strikes. 3 distant smoke fingers rising in separate places. Men came out to shade their eyes, declared it up-country nuisance, and went back inside. An hour later, Stephanie heard the volunteer fire cart rattle past her door. It should have sounded like order. Instead, it sounded like loose iron and panic. She stepped into the street and watched 6 men run with the cart, while one old bay horse struggled in the shafts. The hose coil bounced half off its rack. The canvas looked black with age and cracked where it bent. One coupling was wired in place with what looked like fencing scrap. The hand pump handle had a split pin with a nail. They were not a fire brigade. They were a prayer with wheels. That evening she stood in her ruined bar, palms flat on plank scarred by years of spilled rye, and did what no one expected from a woman in mourning. She changed the business model before pouring a single drink. She sold 2 silver brooches, Eli's spare revolver, and a set of imported china she'd never liked, and came back with cash enough to begin. $12 to a tinsmith for guttering lengths, $9.75 for iron straps and bolts, $18 for a used hand pump from a decommissioned freight yard, 2-inch bore, still true on the piston leather after she re-soaked it in tallow, $3 for lime in 40-pound sacks, $4 for oakum, pitch, and nails, $31 to a teamster for 4 sound water casks at roughly 60 gallons each, cleaned and charred. She hired 2 boys by the day at $1 each, and meals to rip out the back half of the old mahogany bar, where the tap lines had corroded green. Under the floor she found drain channels clogged with tobacco spit and bottle corks, which she had them clear and regrade toward a sump. She paid a Mexican stonemason named Ortega $6 for 2 days to lay brick collaring around the cellar seep and float a lime wash over the north wall. She herself rebuilt the vent shaft with salvaged pipe and a sheet iron hood angled against downdraft wind. Folks watched from the boardwalk and laughed like spectators at a medicine show. "She's hoarding before she's trading," said one ranch hand. "Nah," said another, loud enough for her to hear. "She's cutting the whiskey so thin we'll have to chew it." At the mercantile, a woman asked with church-bright concern whether Stephanie had lost her senses with her husband. At the smithy, a man wagered she'd be bankrupt by first frost. In the evening, 2 drunk cowboys came to her door pretending to ask for jobs and then peered over her shoulder at stacked casks. "Where's the liquor, widow?" "Comin'," she said, "after the water." They laughed all the way to the street. She ignored them and kept building. She set rain troughs from roof edge to 2 upright barrels in the rear yard, each barrel on a timber cradle she braced at 45 degrees so they could not tip in wind. She lined the cellar floor with pallets above the damp line and marked zones in white paint. Water, dry goods, medical, boots/blankets. She bought smoke beans and hard biscuit by the sack when prices were still ordinary. She traded repair work on a widow Miller's chicken coop for extra bandage rolls from Miller's late husband's trunk. She bartered 1 week of bookkeeping for the apothecary in exchange for camphor, carbolic, and 2 sealed tins of salve. At dusk, she posted a handbill on her own door in careful block letters. "Fire drill, Saturday, sunup bucket line practice, all welcome, no charge. Bring pails if you have them." By morning, someone had torn it down and used it to start a cigar. She posted another. When the laughter rose, she did not answer it. She measured hose lengths. She counted steps from her rear door to the nearest pump stand. She timed how long it took to fill a 5-gallon pail from her new hand rig. 22 seconds on full stroke. 28 when the barrel level dropped. On the 14th day after she bought the Bonnet Bell, with smoke still smudging the far ridges and supply wagons nowhere in sight, Stephanie Tucker stood in the alley behind her saloon with lime on her sleeves and a wrench in her hand, listening to men joke that she was watering whiskey before she'd sold her first drink. She looked at the sky, the wind, the old wood of red flint, and kept turning the bolts tighter. The wrench bit into her palm where the handle had lost its wood wrap, and she welcomed the sting because it told her she was still holding firm. "Again," she said. The boy at the pump, Ned, the taller of the 2 she'd hired, leaned his weight onto the handle. Water thudded through the new line, shivered the iron elbow, and struck the inside of the cask with a clean, hollow drum note. No leak at the upper coupling. No leak at the floor seam. A silver bead formed at the threaded joint near the wall, then held. Stop. Ned straightened, panting. That all? For now. She set the wrench down, wrapped oakum once more around the sweating thread, and cinched it another quarter turn until the bead vanished. Then she knelt in the alley dust and marked the date in her notebook. September 17th. Rear line to cellar holds at full stroke. Minor seep fixed. Pump team one-man sustainable 5 minutes before arm fatigue. By sundown, she had a system where a saloon used to be. The old Bonnet Bell had been built for thirst and waste. Beer in, liquor out, slop through cracks. Stephanie rebuilt it for pressure and order. She scavenged 2 lengths of decent pipe from a shuttered laundry and 1 brass junction block from a gambling hall sink, cleaned all 3 in vinegar and hot lye, then fitted them beneath the back bar into a manifold she could isolate by valve. Left valve fed tap 1. Center valve fed tap 2. Right valve fed the hose spigot she'd mounted chest high along the back wall for fast bucket filling. If one line split under strain, she could close it and keep the others running. She moved the prettiest whiskey labels to the far shelf, not to deceive anyone but to quiet argument. Men trusted what looked familiar. Behind the labels, where only she could see, she hung a slate with chalk tallies. Water cask A, 53 gallons. Water cask B, 58 gallons. Water cask C, 61 gallons. Water cask D, 47 gallons. Lime, 3 sacks. Bandages, 19 rolls beans, 86 pounds. Biscuit, 42 pounds. In the cellar, she drove iron hooks into joists and suspended canvas stretchers rolled tight with twine. She built a low table from old bar planks and planed it smooth enough to use for dressing burns or setting splints. Ortega returned one morning and watched her line shelves with scrap newspaper and waxed cloth. "You make hospital," he said. "I make options." He grunted approval and showed her how to set 2 brick channels in the cellar floor so spilled water would run toward the sump instead of pooling under the dry goods pallets. She paid him, then paid him again to teach Ned and the younger boy, Amos, how to tamp clay properly around the rear barrels so they sat cool and stable. By the end of that week, people began coming by not for drink but for odd requests. Mrs. Miller asked if Stephanie could spare a pail while her own split stave was repaired. A blacksmith's apprentice brought a bent hinge and got it straightened in exchange for 4 empty coal sacks. 2 railroad men bought coffee, looked around with puzzled faces at the stacked supplies, and left muttering that she was either a genius or touched. At dawn, she ran drills whether anyone came or not. She'd ring the old brass bell she found hanging in the back hall, a cracked little thing that gave more clatter than tone, and marked the seconds it took to move from counter to pump, from pump to door, from door to alley staging point. She taught Ned and Amos how to pass full buckets without turning their wrists, how to call full and back so no one collided in smoke. She nailed painted arrows on the floorboards, red to the rear exit, white to the cellar stairs. She cut strips from an old sheet and tied them to nails at knee height as guidelines in case the room filled with dark. Her hands were blistered by noon, ink-stained by supper, and trembling with fatigue by lamplight. Still she wrote, because memory alone was a liar when tired. If wind is west, wet church roof first, if sparks jump. If wind is south, protect livery hay before all else. Keep children below window line if smoke thickens. When she lay down on her cot in the back room, she could hear the town laughing through open shutters from the other saloons, half a block away. She listened long enough to know which laugh was aimed at her, and then slept anyway. Mockery settled in Red Flint like dust. Everywhere, ordinary and hard to sweep. It started as jokes shouted from boardwalks and turned quickly into instruction from men who thought instruction was their birthright. Mayor Harlan Pike came by on a Thursday afternoon with his vest strained over a soft belly and his watch chain bright as new coin. He did not remove his hat when he entered. Deke Morrow followed him in, trim beard oiled, banker's cuffs spotless despite the heat, smelling faintly of bay rum and expensive tobacco. They stood where customers should have stood and looked around at stacked casks as if inspecting contraband. "You aiming to open a public house," Pike said, "or a siege camp?" "Both sell what people need," Stephanie replied. Morrow smiled without warmth. "People need confidence, Mrs. Tucker. You keep displaying all this," he flicked 2 fingers toward the barrels, "and you'll spook trade. Men stop spending, payrolls tighten. Everyone suffers. Men can drink confidence at your bar, Mr. Morrow. I'll keep water." Pike's face pinked. "Town doesn't permit hoarding during supply interruption." "Then bring me the ordinance and I'll read it." He did not have one. He had tone instead. "As mayor, I'm advising you neighborly-like. Scale this down." She wiped her hands on a rag. "As owner, I'm declining." They left with the careful politeness of men unused to refusal. By sunset, 3 separate customers had repeated as if by coincidence that the mayor thinks you're making trouble. At church on Sunday, the whispering began in earnest. Women who had nodded to her at the Mercantile turned their shoulders and found other pews. Mrs. Halverson asked with audible pity whether this fixation on fire was part of widows' nerves. Reverend Cole shook her hand after service but spoke the sentence he must have rehearsed. "Fear can become a form of pride, Sister Tucker. Trust Providence." "I trust Providence enough to fill barrels," she said. By Monday, mockery found teeth. A notice appeared tacked crooked on her door in charcoal block letters. "Widow's Watered Whiskey. 2 cents a tier." Ned tore it down before she could, crumpled it, and looked ready to cry with anger. She took the paper from him, smoothed it flat, and used the blank side for inventory calculations. That night, someone loosened the braces on her rear rain trough. At dawn, she found 1 trough collapsed, 1 split at the seam, both barrels tipped and 30 gallons gone into alley mud. She did not curse. She reset the posts deeper, drilled through the straps and pinned them with carriage bolts instead of nails. Then she strung a bell wire from trough frame to her bedpost, so any tampering rang metal in her ear. The next evening, 2 ranch hands spat tobacco juice across her stoop as she was sweeping. "Careful," one said. "You'll drown us all in kindness." She met his eyes until he looked away first, then dumped a bucket of rinse water over the spit and kept sweeping. Institutional contempt came dressed as law. On September 22nd, Sheriff Len Broom arrived with a citation already signed. He had a sun-cracked face and the permanent squint of a man who preferred distance from every argument. He unfolded the paper with unnecessary care. "Obstruction of public alley," he read. "By order of municipal office. Fine of $3 payable within 48 hours. Remove sand barrels and stack timber from rear lane. Those barrels leave a wagon width clear on both sides. Still obstruction," says the office. She glanced at the signature. Pike. Broom shifted his weight, embarrassed. "Mrs. Tucker, I don't write 'em. I carry 'em." She paid from a tin under the counter, coin by coin, and watched him count. "You tell your office this is the cheapest safety they'll ever tax." "I'll tell 'em," he said, but his tone said he wouldn't. When he rode off, Amos kicked the hitch rail hard enough to bark his shin. "It ain't fair." "No," she said. "It's useful." He frowned, not understanding. "Now we know exactly what they'll do." She moved the sand barrels inside the property line, flush against her rear wall, and painted them white so they showed in smoke. She replaced the timber stack with bundled wet hides rolled under the eaves. She shifted everything 6 inches at a time, until not even Pike's clerk could call it obstruction. Still, the town kept at her. Boys sang rhymes outside at dusk. Widow's flood, then ran. Men from the Silver Spur Saloon came in only to peer and smirk, ordering 1 beer to split between them while asking whether she planned to sell fish next. Deke Morrow let it be known at his bank that her credit was uncertain, and any supplier extending terms to her did so without municipal confidence, which wasn't a legal threat, but he had the same effect. She responded the only way she had found that mattered. She built in daylight where everyone could see. Every Saturday at sunup, she posted another drill notice. The first drew no one but Ned, Amos, and Mrs. Miller, with her 2 girls carrying wash tubs. The second drew those 4+ Ortega and a Chinese laundryman named Lin, who said little and moved with perfect economy, passing buckets as if he'd done it all his life. By the 4th drill, 6 children from 3 blocks over showed up because they heard there would be cold biscuits after. Stephanie put them to work running empty pails and shouting commands. They laughed, then learned the rhythm, then stopped laughing because rhythm felt like seriousness. From the boardwalk across the street, Pike watched once with Deke Morrow beside him, both men in pressed coats despite the dust. Pike shook his head as if witnessing indecency. "Playing militia now," he called across. "Practicing survival," Stephanie called back. Morrow raised his voice so others would hear. "You keep prophesying disaster. You may get blamed when business dies before winter." She lifted a full bucket, handed it to Mrs. Miller, and answered without looking up. If business dies from seeing water barrels, it wasn't sturdy enough to live. By the last week of September, signs of trouble multiplied faster than gossip. The mornings came with a red sun you could stare at too long without squinting, because smoke from distant burns had laid a thin veil over the basin. Ash settled overnight in the horse troughs like gray flour. The cottonwoods along Dry Creek had begun dropping leaves before frost, not yellow first, but brittle-edged and brown. Dogs barked at nothing after dark, noses high, catching scents no human could sort. Horses rolled their eyes at wind gusts that carried heat after sundown, when heat should have dropped. Stephanie kept a weather page in her notebook and filled it daily. September 24th. Humidity, low enough lips crack by noon. Wind shift southwest to west, northwest by 3 p.m. Ashfall visible on black cloth. September 25th. Well pressure dropped 2 minutes earlier than usual at evening fill. Sky copper near horizon. September 26th. Static snap from door latch. Smoke column north ridge doubled by dusk. At the depot, the rail agent cursed under his breath while tapping dead keys. Telegraph traffic stuttered, lines west carrying half messages before going blank. A freight team limped in from the Medicine Bow Road with 2 mules singed along their flanks and wagon canvas peppered with pinholes burnt clean through by blown embers. The driver said they'd passed 3 separate grass fires in one day, and a 4th sleeping low in a draw like coals under a blanket. "Wind gets under that one," he said while buying liniment. "You'll see God run." By afternoon that same day, a small blaze jumped a dung heap behind the livery and crawled up a fence line. It should have been nothing. It took 14 men, the volunteer cart, and almost half the town's calm to stop it because the hose coupling blew at first pressure and sprayed sideways into dust. Stephanie watched from 50 yards off as men shouted conflicting orders, tripped over each other, and cursed the pump handle when it jammed. They beat the fire out eventually with wet sacks, but only after it scorched 2 stalls and blistered paint on the neighboring shed. When it was over, she walked up to Pike where he stood dabbing sweat with a handkerchief. "You need assigned crews," she said. "Named, not volunteers by panic. And you need spare couplings, maintained hose and water staged by block before night. Pike glared at her over the handkerchief. We handled it. You got lucky. He looked past her to where townsfolk listened and gave her the smile of a man protecting rank. What we don't need, ma'am, is more alarm from a proprietor trying to sell barrels. She could have shouted. She did not. Then at least tell people to clear brush from their walls and wet roofs at sundown. He turned away without answering. She asked anyway, at the mercantile, at church steps, at hitch rails. Some nodded and did nothing. Some agreed and forgot. A few took her seriously. Mrs. Miller moved her kindling stack, Lynn-soaked blankets, and hung them in his doorway. Ortega cleaned debris from his roof seam. Most said the same thing Red Flint always said when faced with work before crisis. Maybe tomorrow. That night the wind failed entirely for an hour, and the silence felt wrong, as if the whole basin were drawing breath. Stephanie stood in her backyard beside the rebuilt troughs, listening to the small creak of full barrels settling on their braces. The sky to the north flickered once, orange and low, not lightning. Too steady, too hungry. She rang her little bell once, just to hear it, then went inside and laid out rope, gloves, and 3 extra lanterns by the door. At midnight, the bell wire on her bedpost gave a single, bright tremor. She was on her feet before the second ring. By the time her hand found the lamp, the wire sang again, short, metallic, urgent. Not a man tugging once for mischief. A repeated shiver as if the whole trough frame were quaking. She shoved her boots on, snatched the shotgun from beside the cot, and went through the back door into a wind that felt like someone opening an oven. It was 12:11 a.m., September 27th, and the air was still 81 degrees. The bell wire snapped against its nail as the left rain trough shuddered. Not from tampering, from gusts. Wind had come up hard from the north in the 5 minutes she'd been asleep, strong enough to rattle the barrel braces. Over the rooftops, the horizon pulsed orange in 3 places at once, low and steady. Embers came with the gusts, tiny red insects drifting and dying in the alley dirt. Stephanie lowered the shotgun. "Ned!" she shouted toward the side room where the boys slept. "Amos, up now." By 12:18, both boys stumbled out shirtless and blinking. She had them in boots and wet neckcloths by lantern light. No wasted words. "Ned, check rear braces, then pump prime. Amos, cellar lamps and stair rope. Move." At 12:24, the first town alarm bell began clanging from near the livery. Wild, uneven strikes, not a practiced peal. Another bell answered from farther south. Dogs exploded into barking. A horse screamed high and human. Then came the sound she had dreaded since she arrived in Red Flint. Running feet without direction. People flooded the boardwalk in nightshirts and suspenders, carrying quilts, ledgers, babies, bird cages, whatever their hands found first. Someone shouted, "Stockyard fence is lit." Another voice, "No, it's the freight shed." Another, "Get to the church." At 12:31, the volunteer fire cart rattled into view, lantern swinging from its side, one wheel already wobbling. Men hauled it half running because the old bay horse had gone lathered and mad-eyed. They turned into Cutter Lane, hit a rut, and the hose coil spilled into the street like a dropped snake. 3 men bent to wrestle it, and another screamed at them to leave it. Leave it. Just pump. Stephanie stood in her doorway and watched the town's plan fail in less than 40 seconds. The first line charged, coughed, and burst at the cracked coupling she had seen weeks ago. A white arc sprayed uselessly into darkness. Men cursed and beat at the leak with bare hands, as if force could shame canvas into holding. By 12:47, spot fires had jumped 2 blocks ahead of the visible glow. Embers lodged in dry shingles under eaves in hay chaff. Fire no longer moved like a single beast. It moved like thrown seed. "Bucket line here," Stephanie shouted, ringing her cracked brass bell with a wrench. "Tucker House, rear alley. Water ready." Some ignored her. Some ran past. But Mrs. Miller came first, hair unpinned, daughters behind her carrying pails too big for their arms. Lynn arrived with 2 wet blankets over his shoulders. Ortega came with his shirt wrapped around his mouth and a spade in one hand. Within minutes, they had 10 people, and then 15, then enough to make rhythm. Full to Miller, Miller to Lynn, Lynn to Ortega. Keep it moving. At 1:16 a.m., the north wind veered west and doubled. Flames took Pike's grain warehouse on Elk Street in a single rush, climbing the dry clapboard as if it were lampwick. The mayor himself appeared in the intersection in his night trousers and waistcoat, shouting orders nobody obeyed. He pointed men toward the warehouse well. The rope snapped on the second bucket. He ordered a backburn in the lane. No one had clear ground, and it raced wrong way into stacked feed. Across from him, Deke Morrow's Silver Spur lost its painted sign first, then its porch awning. A barrel inside popped with a muffled boom, spraying sparks through the front windows. Men who'd spent years drinking there stood in the street and watched like mourners at a coffin, too shocked to move until roof tar began dripping flame. By 2:05, heat drove everyone to cover their faces with wet cloth. The town water tower groaned as demand surged. Pressure at the public pumps dropped to a miserable trickle. Twice, men abandoned lines to sprint for distant wells, came back with half buckets, sloshed dry by panic. At Tucker House, Tap 1 ran hard. Tap 2 sputtered once, then recovered. Amos worked the hand pump until his arms shook. Ned took over, then Lynn, then Ortega. Stephanie rotated them every 3 minutes and slapped hands away from overfilling. "Half buckets move faster. You want to save walls or drown your boots?" An ember storm hit at 2:41, sweeping down Maine like red sleet. Her west trough, rebuilt after sabotage, took 3 hits and held. The right brace split anyway with a gunshot crack. Barrel B lurched. Ned lunged shoulder under the timber and kept it from rolling long enough for Ortega to jam a brick under the skid. "Leave it," Ned gasped. "We don't leave 60 gallons, Stephanie snapped. "Pin it." They pinned it. At 3:12, the jail roof caught. At 3:20, the telegraph office chimney collapsed through its own floor. Sparks rose in a column visible from every street in town. Whatever messages Red Flint might have sent for help burned with it. By dawn, 5:53 a.m., red sun behind smoke. The first assault had run for nearly 6 hours without pause. Parts of town smoldered in ugly low burns. Parts still flamed high. And everyone understood now. This was not a brush scare to joke about over breakfast. This was a day that could erase Red Flint if it kept feeding. The suffering came not in one dramatic scream, but in accumulations. By 7:10 a.m., people had stopped asking if they should flee and started asking where there was water enough to stand and breathe. The church basement filled first, then the schoolhouse, then any cellar with stone walls and no liquor fumes. Mothers tied wet handkerchiefs over infants' mouths. Men who had laughed at Stephanie's drills now waited bareheaded at her rear spigot. Eyes raw, hands shaking around borrowed pails. Heat rose to 98 before noon. Smoke turned sunlight copper and made noon look like bad dusk. The first death she saw was Tommy Vance, the blacksmith's apprentice, a boy of 17 with soot always in the lines of his hands. At 8:03, he ran into the livery with a hatchet to free the last 2 mares still kicking in their stalls. Witnesses said he got 1 rope cut before the loft, already weakened by the night fire, dropped a burning beam across his back. They dragged him out by his boots. He was alive for 6 minutes, asking if the gray mare got clear. Then he wasn't. His master, Eli Vance, sat in the dirt beside him with both palms on the boy's chest, as if pressure could keep a soul from leaking out. At 9:27, Mrs. Halverson died 3 doors from her own kitchen. She had escaped once, neighbors said, with her shawl and account book. Then she remembered the cedar box that held her dead daughter's letters and went back in while men were wetting the roofline. The front room held. The hallway did not. They found her near the parlor threshold with the cedar box clasped to her chest, face turned toward the door she almost reached. Someone laid her on a quilt in the street. No one had spare water to wash the soot from her hair. At 11:40, Reverend Cole collapsed on the church steps after carrying 2 children and an old man out of a smoke-thick vestry. He was breathing when they laid him in shade. By noon, he was gone, lips cracked, lungs burned from heat and ash. The same man who had told Stephanie to trust Providence died with his hand still clenched around a brass cross he must have grabbed without thinking. None of the deaths were clean. All were witnessed. That was worse. The town's little plans failed one by one. Pike's emergency stores, such as they were, had been kept in a shed with 1 padlock and no inventory list. By mid-morning, half was trampled, half stolen, and none of it where it needed to be. Morrow opened his bank vault to protect account books and cash boxes, while families begged him for water casks. He had none to give. The volunteer brigade split into shouting factions about where to defend first. Men who should have been on roofs drifted toward their own homes, understandable and disastrous. The sheriff tried to assign watches, then vanished for an hour, when the jail wall buckled and prisoners had to be moved. Stephanie's preparations did not make her invincible. They made her useful. At Tucker House, she had limits she could name. 4 main casks, 2 rain barrels, 1 pump line, 1 spare valve. She posted those limits in chalk and enforced them even when people cursed her for stinginess. 2 gallons per family now, she said. More if you're on active line. If you can stand, you can pass buckets. She sent Amos with 3 children to soak blankets in rotation. Wet, hang, re-wet. She stationed Ned at the medical table in the cellar with boiled cloth, carbolic, and strict instructions. Cool burns first, ointment second. Never break blisters. Lynn organized a silent line of laundry poles to knock sparks from eaves. Ortega and Mrs. Miller took roof duty in shifts, crawling low over shingles, slapping ember nests before they could feed. By 1:15 p.m., 32 people had cycled through Tucker House for water, dressing, or shelter from smoke. By 2 o'clock, it was 50. A crying toddler slept under Stephanie's carpenter's bench with 2 kittens someone had thrust into her arms and forgotten to reclaim. A gambler with singed eyebrows held a basin for an old Cheyenne woman whose cough would not stop. A ranch hand who had spat on Stephanie's stoop the week before spent an hour fanning air over Mrs. Miller's youngest because the child was glassy-eyed from heat and smoke. Outside, dignity burned off people faster than skin. Men fought over 2 intact buckets near the depot ruins until one split at the handle and both stood there stunned, each holding half. Women tore petticoats into face wraps. Teenagers ran messages because adults could not see through tears and smoke. Horses broke loose and thundered down alleys wild-eyed, manes singed. Chickens, crazed by heat, flung themselves against coop slats until necks snapped. At 3:08, the west wall of Morrow's bank annex ignited where wind had driven sparks into the eave seam. Clerks dragged ledgers into the street while Morrow shouted to save the safe first. Townsmen ignored him and formed a line to the neighboring boarding house instead, where 4 children were trapped behind a jammed door. Morrow stood with his polished boots in ash and watched his status melt with his paint. At 4:22, Mayor Pike's office roof collapsed. The sign reading Municipal Hall fell face first into mud and steam. Pike was there to see it. Shirt sleeves rolled, eyes bloodshot. No chain on his vest now, no hat. Someone asked where the fire levy money had gone. He pretended not to hear and kept slinging water. By late afternoon, the town looked like a battlefield after cavalry had passed twice. Half walls, smoking beams, people moving in jerks from exhaustion rather than intent. And still no outside help. The telegraph poles north of town had burned through at their bases and dropped their lines in looping black ropes across the road. Riders sent east came back saying wind made progress impossible through the draws. Red Flint was alone with what it had. What it had, increasingly, was Tucker House. At 5:03 p.m., when the sun should have been high and hard, the sky darkened to bruised orange, and a stranger stumbled through Stephanie's front door. He got 2 steps inside before his knees gave out. "Water," he croaked, and the word came as dust. He was a teamster, maybe 40, maybe older under the burns, hat gone, eyebrows singed away, shirt fused to one shoulder where skin had blistered and split. His hands were wrapped in rag strips blackened at the fingertips. One boot was missing. His socks smoked at the toe. Ned moved first, trying to lift him, trying to lift. Stephanie was faster. "Not flat," she said. "Sit him up, small sips." She knelt, braced the man against her knee, and tipped a tin cup to his mouth in careful measures. He drank like an animal for 3 swallows, choked on the 4th, coughed black streaks onto the floorboards, then grabbed her sleeve with frightening strength. "Ravine," he said. "Fire jumped, north ravine, whole front, coming." "How far?" 2 hours, less if wind turns." He sucked air through cracked lips. "Telegraph's down, poles all down, no cavalry, no one coming." The room went still except for the pump handle in back. Sheriff Broom appeared in the doorway behind him, soot to his elbows, badge blackened. He had a child in his arms, a boy of about 8 with a blanket over his head, coughing hard and clinging to Broom's coat. Broom looked at Stephanie the way men look at a rope when floodwater has already taken the bridge. "Mrs. Tucker," he said, voice raw. "Church is full. School's smoke-choked. We need your cellar for children and the hurt." He hesitated, swallowed pride that tasted like blood and ash, then added, "Please." Behind him, Mayor Pike stood in the street with 3 men and 6 empty buckets, waiting but not stepping in. Deke Morrow was farther back, coat gone, carrying a crate of bandages salvaged from somewhere, eyes fixed on the floor. Stephanie rose. "Amos," she called. "Clear dry goods shelf 2. Move beans to upper rack. Ned stretchers down. Lynn wet cloth station at the stairs. Mrs. Miller, children first, then burn cases. Ortega, I need that rear lane open to wagon with." She looked to Broom. "Bring them. All of them. No bargain, no speech, no condition." Pike took one uncertain step toward the door. "Mrs. Tucker, if you'd—" She cut him off with a pointed finger toward the pump yard. "Bucket line starts now, Mayor. You carry or you get out of the way." He nodded once, hard, and went. Within 10 minutes, Tucker House transformed from stubborn curiosity into command post by necessity. Children were counted at the stairhead and tied in pairs with cloth strips, so none wandered blind in smoke. The teamster was stripped, burns cooled, shoulder dressed in salve and clean bandage torn from one of Morrow's own account cloths. Broom laid the boy on the plain plank table and held him while Stephanie checked his breathing and soot-choked airways with steady hands and a face carved from fatigue. Outside, boots pounded, buckets sloshed, orders snapped by name instead of panic. Inside, the taps that had made men laugh poured clear and constant, and as the light dimmed toward a false night, with a second and larger fire front eating the north ravine, people who had mocked her all month lined up at her door and asked one by one what to do next. Stephanie did not answer with comfort. She answered with work. "Roof crews," she shouted, standing on the bar rail so the room could see her through smoke and lamplight. "If you can climb and keep your head, you're with Ortega out the rear. Bucket runners line from Tap 1 through the alley to Elk Street. Childminders and burn watch stay below. No one freelances. If you leave your post, you tell Lynn first. Say it back to me." Voices came ragged, then louder. "No freelancing." She pointed to Pike where he stood at the door, shirt pasted to his back. "Mayor, you're on Tap 2. Full stroke, steady, no heroics." Pike stared once as if reflex still wanted to object. Then he crossed to the pump and took the handle. "Morrow," she said. "Stair count. Every child in and out. By name." Deke Morrow flinched at being ordered like hired help, but he took the slate from her and nodded. Broom shifted the coughing boy in his arms. "And me?" "You keep the lane clear and your temper cooler than the air. We can't save anybody if men start fighting over pails." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "That may be my first honest duty all year." The second fire front hit at 6:42 p.m. Wind shoved across the North Ravine exactly as the teamster warned. It came low at first, eating grass and fence rails, then stood up in the gusts and threw embers block after block ahead of itself. Roofs did not ignite all at once. They took spark, smoldered, and then burst when nobody watched the seam. Stephanie made everyone watch seams. Not the pretty flames. She barked at a pair of ranch boys on the schoolhouse roof. The eaves, the corners, fire hides before it shouts. She handed them soaked burlap and showed them how to slap, lift, and check for glow before moving on. She taught a butcher's wife to read Wind by Ashdrift. She taught 3 teenagers to rotate every 4 minutes so no one fainted with a full bucket in hand. She tied rope lines between porches so runners could keep direction when smoke turned the street to blindness. Inside Tucker House, the old whiskey taps ran clear and hard. Men who had once demanded rye now crowded the counter shouting, "Left tap full and right tap next," not as jokes but as cadence. The barroom floor became slick with spilled water and black footprints. It smelled of wet wood, carbolic, and fear. At 7:25, a wealthy merchant named Bellamy arrived, dragging a brass-bound trunk from his burning storefront. "My papers," he wheezed. "Where can I stash—" Stephanie shoved a half bucket into his hands. "On the line." He looked down at his polished cuff, then toward his trunk as if choosing between identities. "Now," she said. He went. At 8:03, Pike's gold watch chain snapped from his vest while he pumped. He let it fall in the mud without bending to retrieve it. At 8:40, Morrow's own bank roof gave way in a crash that sent sparks 50 feet high. He was in Tucker House cellar counting children when the sound came. He froze, chalk in hand, listening to timbers that had represented his power, all his adult life collapse into a hiss of steam and cinders. "How many?" Stephanie asked him. He blinked hard, looked at the slate. 29 below. 3 moved to Mrs. Miller for clean air. 1 missing from last count. No, found. 33 safe. Then keep counting. By 9:10, the volunteer fire cart sat abandoned with a broken axle in Cutter Lane, its expensive painted sideboards blistered and useless. Beside it, Stephanie's cheapest purchase, the salvaged hand pump she'd bought for $18, kept a whole block wet enough to live. By 10:27, the line from Tucker House had split in 2 directions. One to the schoolhouse roof, one to Lynn's laundry and the livery behind it. People passed pails in rhythm and called names at each handoff, because names held better than panic. Ortega, here. Miller, here. Pike, a beat. Here, Pike answered, voice hoarse. Just after 11, with the sky still orange and the town sounding like a forge, two men tried to shove past the line and fill a wagon barrel for themselves. Broom caught one by the collar. The other drew back a fist. Before it landed, the ranch hand who had once spat on Stephanie's stoop stepped between them. "She said 2 gallons per family unless you're on line," he shouted. "You want more? Pick up a damn bucket." The man lowered his fist. He picked up a bucket. Teaching had become law because survival required it. Near midnight, when crews rotated and the first momentary lull settled over the block, Stephanie called Pike, Morrow, and Broom into the barroom. Lynn and Mrs. Miller followed without being asked. Ortega came in from the roof, face ash-streaked, and leaned by the door. A dozen others crowded close, wet, exhausted, listening. Stephanie reached under the counter and brought out a flour tin blackened at the edges. Pike looked at it, then at her, and went pale under soot. "Not now," he said. "For God's sake, not now." "Now is when witnesses are present," she replied. She set the tin on the counter, opened it, and took out oilcloth and ledger pages, some originals, some copies in her own hand. Morrow swore under his breath. Broom closed his eyes briefly, as if a prediction had arrived right on schedule. Stephanie held up the first page so lamplight caught the columns. "Fire levy collections, 2 years running. Amount posted to public notice and amount deposited to municipal account do not match." No one spoke. She held up the second. "Reservoir rights transfer to Dry Bend Holdings. Signed by Mayor Pike. Brokered through Morrow and Flint Bank. Rights sold downriver. Red Flint's reserve reduced to this town's risk." A woman whispered, "That's why the tower ran low in June." Stephanie's voice stayed flat. "Sheriff's office received 3 written complaints about hose condition, missing couplings, and levee discrepancies. Filed, then marked resolved with no action." All eyes turned to Broom. He swallowed. "I marked them." A murmur rose, anger, disbelief, the sound of a community recognizing itself cheated in the middle of catastrophe. Pike lifted both hands. "I can explain." "Then explain out loud," Stephanie said. "All of it." He stared at the floorboards, then at the people pressed shoulder to shoulder in the room he once mocked. There was nowhere left for mayoral tone to stand. "We were short after the winter freight losses," he said, voice scraping. "Town account was already overdrawn. I moved levy funds to cover notes, meant to repay when cattle tax came in. Then the tax came light. We kept shifting. I told myself we'd fix it next quarter." "You stole it," Mrs. Miller said. He nodded once like a man taking a blow. "Yes." Morrow spoke next, faster as if speed could reduce guilt. "The reservoir sale was legal. Dry Bend offered cash and rail preference. I believed we could draw enough from wells and seasonal runoff. It looked efficient on paper." "Efficient," Ortega repeated in disbelief. Morrow's jaw tightened. "It was profit. For the bank. For me." Broom's turn came last. He took off his blackened badge, set it on the bar. "I buried the complaints," he said. Pike asked for time. Morrow promised repairs after shipment. I accepted favors and told myself keeping peace mattered more than paperwork. It was cowardice dressed as pragmatism. Outside, someone shouted for more water. Inside, no one moved. Stephanie folded the pages carefully and put them back in the tin. "You 3 can run tonight," she said, and pointed toward the dark beyond the door. "No one here has strength to chase you. Or you can get back on the line and keep working until dawn. And tomorrow you stand herein before every soul still breathing in Red Flint. Choose." Pike looked toward the street where flames reflected in every window. Morrow looked at his ink-stained hands. Broom looked at the child-crowded cellar stairs. Without another word, all three went back outside and lifted buckets. No one stopped them. No one forgave them. But they stayed. They worked until their palms tore and dawn turned the smoke from orange to gray. Sunrise came at 6:01 a.m. in a town half erased. By full light, Red Flint looked like a map somebody had burned at the edges, blocks intact beside blocks flattened to black ribs and chimneys. Pike's office gone. Morrow's bank annex gone. Telegraph office, freight shed, 2 saloons, 3 houses, church vestry, and most of Elk Street gone. But the schoolhouse stood. The livery stood. Lynn's laundry stood with scorched trim. Tucker House stood, roof soaked and smoking but whole, cellar full of the living. 37 people who would likely have died in heat, smoke, or crowd panic were counted alive because they had water, shelter, and orders. No one laughed that morning. They stood in the street wrapped in wet blankets and stared at Stephanie as if seeing her for the first time and finding no name yet big enough. The hearing was held 3 days later in the schoolhouse because it had the largest roof left. At noon, the room was packed. Ranchers in smoke-stiff coats, widows, laborers, clerks, railmen, laundry girls, children perched on windowsills, men with bandaged hands. The dead were named first: Tommy Vance, Mrs. Halverson, Reverend Cole, and 2 drifters no one could identify. Silence followed each name like a bell toll. Then Sheriff Broom, no badge, stood before the room with wrists bound in front, more from symbol than necessity. Pike and Morrow stood beside him under guard by 2 miners with shotguns across their arms. Judge Asa Nettle from the next district, summoned by Ryder once roads cleared enough, sat at a school desk with the law book open and soot still in its pages. "We are not hanging men today," Nettle said before anyone could shout otherwise. "We are establishing facts." Voices rose anyway. "Facts? Half my block is ash. They sold us dry. String them up now and save ink." Judge Nettle pounded the desk with a ruler until quiet came raggedly. "Mrs. Tucker," he said, "you petitioned for this hearing. Present what you have." Stephanie stepped forward with the flour tin and a stack of signed witness statements. Her dress was still black, now patched at one elbow with canvas. Her hands were wrapped in clean cloth where blisters had cracked. She laid the ledgers down one by one. "Fire levy records," she said. "Reservoir sale contract. Sheriff complaint log with altered dispositions. Copies made before the fire. Originals recovered after." Nettle examined signatures, dates, amounts. He looked up at Pike. "Do you contest?" Pike's shoulders sagged. "No." At Nettle's nod, Mrs. Miller came forward and testified to hearing Pike's confession in Tucker House, with 15 witnesses present. Lynn testified through a translator that Morrow admitted profit motive for the water rights sale. Ortega testified that Broom acknowledged burying complaints for favor. Ned and Amos testified to years no longer than their ages, voices shaking but clear. When it was Morrow's turn, he tried one last defense. Decisions were made under economic strain. "You people wanted growth." "We wanted water," a woman shouted from the back. Nettle raised a hand. "Order." Morrow swallowed and said no more. By the time testimony closed, anger in the room had thickened to something dangerous and hot. A rancher near the door yelled, "Rope's cheaper than trials." 3 men answered him with hard nods. Judge Nettle looked to Stephanie. "You have standing as complainant and as organizer of emergency response. Recommendation." All eyes moved to her. She could feel hatred in the room like dry wind waiting for spark. She could also feel children breathing in the hallway behind the door. She spoke without hurry. "If you hang them," she said, "you get 1 afternoon of satisfaction and none of your water back." None of your couplings. None of your dead. Murmurs, angry and confused. She kept going. Seize what they own that can be sold. Land notes, livestock shares, bank holdings, office lots. Put every dollar to reservoir restoration and fire equipment. Put Pike and Morrow and Broom to labor under guard on the same ditches and stonework they neglected. Make them haul the line they sold. Publish town accounts monthly in the square where everyone can read them, not in locked desks. Establish mandatory fire brigades by block with named captains. Weekly drill. Fine anyone who skips without cause. And no office holder touches levy funds without 3 signatures and public ledger. A man barked. Too soft. She turned to him. Soft is pretending revenge rebuilds roofs. The room went quiet in increments. Judge Nettle studied her, then the crowd, then banged the ruler once. Recommendation entered. He ruled before sunset. Pike removed as mayor, fined beyond his immediate means, properties seized to cover levy theft. Morrow removed from banking authority, assets frozen and liquidated toward waterworks. Broom stripped of office, fined and remanded to supervise labor detail with the others. No lynching, no private retribution. Restitution under law. There were curses. There were tears. There was also, for the first time in Red Flint's memory, a written schedule for rebuilding the reservoir, posted publicly the same day. When Nettle asked who would chair the new Emergency and Accounts Committee until election, half the room spoke one name at once. Mrs. Tucker. She shook her head once. Stephanie, if I'm doing the work. A thin laugh broke from somewhere, not mocking this time. Relief finding a crack. Nettle nodded. Stephanie Tucker, then. Swear her in. Broom, hands bound, stepped forward when ordered and held out the Bible with a face like carved stone. She placed her burned palm on it and took the oath from the man who had fined her for sand barrels. After the hearing, apologies came awkwardly, never all at once. The ranch hand who had spat on her stoop removed his hat and stood twisting it. Ma'am, I was a fool. You were scared and loud, she said. Try scared and useful next time. Mrs. Halvorson's sister, eyes red with grief, whispered, We called you prideful. Stephanie touched her sleeve. You were wrong about me. Not wrong to miss your sister. Even Pike's wife came at dusk, shoulders shaking, asking whether she might fetch him clean bandages for labor crew if she brought them herself, and took no special favor. Stephanie gave her a list of what all workers needed and said, Bring enough for everyone on that gang. Then, yes. No triumph, no gloating, just terms that served the living. The new sign went up on a cold morning in November. Ned and Amos held the ladder while Ortega set the last bolt. Lynn passed up a paint pot. Stephanie stood in the street, neck craned as the board swung into place above the former bonnet bell doors. Widow Tucker's house water always on tap. Someone in the crowd, nobody ever admitted who, started clapping. The sound spread down the block until even those with wrapped hands thumped palms against coat sleeves to join. Inside, the mirrors were replaced with plain pine shelves. One wall held maps and bucket assignments by block. Another held a glass front cabinet with burn dressings, splints, and spare gloves. The old gaming tables had been cut down into benches for drill meetings and town accounts nights. The taps still poured whiskey when ordered, but above them hung painted labels in neat script. Left, water right, water center, water first. On opening day, the first drink sold was coffee to a rail hand. The second was rye to Ortega, who toasted the room and said, To preparedness and stubborn women. Laughter followed, warm, not sharp. At sundown, the bell rang for weekly drill. People came. June 1891, 2 summers later. Pike, Morrow, and Broom worked in striped convict shirts under guard. shoveling clay and setting stone on the rebuilt reservoir wall east of town. Children from school walked out with pails as part of their lesson and watched in solemn rows, while Stephanie, now committee chair Tucker in the ledgers, explained sluice gates and overflow channels. "Write this down," she told them, tapping the chalkboard propped on a crate. "Water is not a miracle. It is a system." A boy in the front row asked, "Even if it rains?" "Especially if it rains." Broom, sweating in silence nearby, glanced once toward her and then back to his shovel. August 1894, another dry lightning season. Sparks hit brush south of the tracks at dusk. Alarm bell rang. Within 3 minutes, block captains were at stations. Within 9, bucket lines were moving from 4 cistern points. Within 20, fire was boxed to 1 vacant lot and a fence. No deaths. Afterward, at the drill report, a young woman who had been one of the children tied in pairs in Tucker House cellar read the casualty line aloud with wonder in her voice. None. October 1902. Red Flint, now incorporated and no longer territory, dedicated a brick pump house by the creek with a cast iron plaque listing contributors. Some wanted Stephanie's name first. She insisted names be alphabetical and include the labor gang, including Pike, Morrow, and Broom, whose sentences had long since ended and whose reputations never quite did. At the dedication, Mayor Ellen Miller, Mrs. Miller's oldest daughter, elected fair and square, rang a polished brass bell mounted on a post. "It belonged to Tucker House," she said. "Still does, really." The crowd laughed softly. Stephanie, gray now at the temple, stood near the back and didn't step forward until children pulled her by both hands. Spring 1910. In the rebuilt schoolhouse, a teacher held up a faded handbill under glass. "Fire drill. Saturday sun-up bucket. Line practice. All welcome." "Who posted this?" she asked. 30 small voices answered from memory. "Stephanie Tucker." "What happened when people laughed?" A girl with ink on her fingers answered, "They learned." Across town, Widow Tucker's house still open before dawn. Coffee first, then chores, then accounts posted monthly on a board outside where anyone could read. On hot afternoons, travelers still stopped under the sign and smiled at the words, "Water always on tap," like they were quaint. Old-timers would shake their heads and correct them. Not quaint. Ned, now Captain Ned Harper of Red Flint Fire Brigade, would say, one hand on the same pump handle he'd worked as a boy. That's policy. And when wind came up strange from the north and ash rode it like memory, no one in Red Flint called preparation panic anymore. They called it respect, for weather, for truth, and for the widow in black who had once bought a broken saloon and taught a whole town that survival is something you build before the flames.